Hi, and welcome to the Luminaries In and Out of Sect podcast, a show about the moon and how astrologers embody and relate to it. My name is SB Hall, and I'm your host. In today's episode on the Scorpio Moon as the Luminary out of Sect, I speak with the astrologer Caleb McCoy. Earlier in November was the anniversary of the launch of the podcast, and this is the last episode of my moon series, and I just want to take a moment to say how grateful and honored I feel to have been able to do this work and have these conversations over the last year. I want to thank everyone that listened, shared the show, supported me financially, and I want to give a very special thank you to all of my guests that have come onto the show to talk with me. I couldn't have done it without you, and I really appreciate you sharing your time, wisdom, and experience with us all. Thank you so much. But as many of you know, this isn't the end of the podcast. Earlier this month, I started a sun sign series, and I'm really excited to be moving into this new chapter of the podcast as we now have surpassed this first anniversary of its creation. I really hope you enjoy the new series. Before we get into this episode, I do want to offer a bit of a content warning on this one. A lot of this episode revolves around Caleb and I discussing the philosophical problem of suicide. I do think that we come to a pretty hopeful conclusion as a result of our own academic and spiritual and personal journeys, how we've answered these questions for ourselves. But I do want to give listeners a heads up on that so that you can dive into this episode when you're emotionally and mentally prepared to navigate those topics. As always, if you enjoy the work that I'm doing, please contribute to the podcast's sustainability by becoming a supporting member or offering a one-time donation on my website. There you can also find information on my services. I'm offering natal and timing consultations as well as answering horary questions. Hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, Caleb McCoy, thank you so much for being on the podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing really well. I mean, you've probably seen by glancing at my chart how personal a lot of the astrology of 2023 has been, just the way it's locked into my chart.
Mm-hmm.
But in spite of that, I've been pleasantly surprised by how a lot of the transits have shown up. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I don't know, I can't complain. It's actually been a really good year.
That's amazing. Yeah, for those who are interested, we're recording on Saturday, November 4th at approximately 1:10 p.m. Eastern time. Um, just for the data heads out there, the Virgo placements perhaps. Do you yeah, how has the recent astrology been? We just went through eclipse season.
hmm
There was a Venus retrograde this summer. Things have been going on. How has it been for you lately?
I mean, the Venus retrograde was basically my extended Venus return,
Mm-hmm.
since it's stationed retrograde on my Venus, and the one 8 years prior to that was a pretty pivotal summer in my life. So I
Mm-hmm.
was really intrigued how this one would play out, and it was cool
Mm.
how I went into the summer having moved to a new place and kind of having these experiences of being oh, I'm kind of lonely. Sometimes I feel kind of solitary. I'd like to connect with more people, and then the
Mm-hmm.
weekend Venus stationed direct in early September, it was oh my gosh, I'm almost overwhelmed by all these social engagements and all these connections I've made. It's a
Mm-hmm.
super social summer, and it was really cool having I don't know, and yeah, just coming into a space where I felt like I was almost uh, just went from a dearth or a poverty of relationships to almost being overwhelmed or super wealthy in them, right?
Mm-hmm.
um and then with eclipse season, um it's weird because we're in this eclipses are liminal in and of themselves, but
Right.
being in a year where we're between these eclipse series,
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm just really grateful to get it out of my second and eighth house axis, because
Mm-hmm.
hungry Rahu in the eighth meant taking on debt, and the south node in my second meant a lot of expenses sucking away money
Mm-hmm.
from me. So it's just those eclipses tied in really well, with some astrology good, but personally bad experiences with money, right?
Yeah.
So I'm excited for like to see that starting to turn around, for
Hmm.
like Jupiter in Taurus to actually start stabilizing my eighth house. You know what I mean?
Right. And for those of you that perhaps can't, um, like project the image of the chart in your mind, Caleb, you have Libra rising. So you have that 11th house of Leo where Venus went retrograde.
Yeah,
So it's very fitting that at the beginning, you're feeling a certain way about community or like groups
yeah,
of people or relationships. And by the end, there's this kind of complete rewriting of that house. And yeah, you have this Taurus eighth house, whole sign house, like all Libra risings.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, just want to kind of give some clarity with that. Yeah, it's really interesting, curious to hear your thoughts about this. Do you feel like the seventh house, um, I, I think that the last two Taurus eclipses have been really interesting because I've
Mm,
seen them as both like a dual kind of Taurus Aries eclipse, because
mm-hmm.
there's been either the luminaries in Aries and the node is in Taurus still, or
Yes.
now the node is in Aries but the luminary was in Taurus, and so there's this kind of mixing of these signs and houses, and I've seen that kind of manifest in my life, and I'm curious your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting is that like the theme that carries forward though, because of the way that like the baton is being passed in terms of
Mhm.
rulership, is that it goes from Mars and Venus to Mars and Venus, right? But
Mm,
just like opposite ends of the zodiac, right?
right.
So those themes remain the same. And I don't know about you, but like in my personal experience, those like we often think about houses that can't see each other, like the ones that are adjacent or averse to one another, right? They have no aspectual relationship, and therefore we see them as being like distinct places. But I think whether you can chalk that up to the rulership, or as you're saying, the nodes being in one sign, but then the luminary being in another, there's been a thematic bleed
Hmm.
between one or the other. They've been still inextricably interlinked and unable to be cleanly cut apart. I don't know if that's been
Right.
your experience too.
Yeah, totally. Um, yeah, I don't know if there's like a intertwining of significations, like for me, fifth, sixth house significations, but there's
Mm,
definitely like both fifth and sixth house stuff happening at the same time, and
yeah,
sometimes
totally.
intertwined for sure. Um, yeah, beautiful way of putting it. Thank you for explaining that. You have a way with words, my friend. Almost like you have Mercury in the first house. Um, all right, wonderful. Well, Caleb, can you give us an introduction to yourself and your astrological practice?
Yeah, so I'm a drummer, a writer, an astrologer, I think most importantly, a father, and I live here in Portland,
Mm-hmm.
Oregon, which is the traditional land of the Clackamas and Cowlitz peoples. I've got a particular interest in the malefic planets.
Mm,
I kind of planted my flag as heavy metal astrology, and I see heavy metal as being essentially a malefic form of music, right? Filled
mm-hmm.
with tons of malefic imagery. That's
Mm-hmm.
like the bread, my bread and butter, right? What I listen to all day. So I seek a way of marrying those two together, and I see that in terms of like really focusing on the malefics in my practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think in terms of like how I approach astrology, I was somewhat fortunate in that I came in through occultism, or like I should say, came into traditional astrology through occultism rather than modern
Mm,
astrology. I kind of like
okay.
skipped that route. I know a lot of people will come in through that door,
Mm-hmm.
but actually, like I was pretty skeptical of astrology for a long time. I thought it was like this weird vestigial organ that the like Western occult tradition had picked up and just carried with it for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But I couldn't see like how there was a causal relationship between the planets, what they're doing, the positions of the stars, etc.,
Mm.
and how that would.
Do you think there is a causal relationship?
Well, I feel like the deeper I get into astrology, the more I am open to that like causal there being some kind of causal mechanism,
Mm-hmm.
but being uninformed and not as well read, and I think just like an arrogant 20-year-old, I was like, no, this is nonsense, right?
Right.
Um, but the what I later realized is you can't truly get into Western occultism without encountering astrology. It's like trying to take the starch out of a potato. Like it's
Mm.
just baked in there.
Yeah.
So it's like hearing Austin Coppock then talk on an occult podcast that like opened me up to it. I mean, like,
Mm.
oh, okay, I didn't realize that, rather than it being this form of like pseudo pop psychology, it's this living tradition that goes back thousands of years. It has these incredible predictive techniques, this beautiful archetypal tableau with which it can kind of like paint like images of your life in both broad and very fine strokes. So like when it came to time to receive formal training, I ended up taking Adam Ellenboss's year one class.
Mm-hmm.
I like in terms of teachers, I see him as like probably my number one
Okay.
teacher or biggest
Cool.
influence as far as how I approach
Mm-hmm.
astrology. And he himself is like, you know, based in ancient astrology, but obviously incorporates, I think, a lot of like modern techniques. And I
Mm-hmm.
do the same, like still
Mm-hmm.
using the outer planets like Neptune and Pluto and so on.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Um, but yeah, and then I would say like also later on I was star pilled by the work of Maya Rourke and Sasha Ravich. So I really am interested now in the fixed stars and starting to incorporate their mythology into my readings, into how I approach astrology. And I
Mm-hmm.
think like lastly, just as like a foundation, like anything in my life, I try to approach from the lens or from a baseline of being a Buddhist, and I feel like my own practice of Buddha or Buddha Dharma is like the point from which I like to approach everything, including astrology. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Hope that makes sense.
Wonderful. Totally. Yeah. I mean, I'm particularly interested in how spirituality and astrology kind of intersect. So I'm curious how your spiritual foundation, if it's okay to, or if it's like, accurate to describe Buddhism as that, as a
Yeah.
spirituality, how that interplays with astrology for you.
Yeah, for sure. I think that is actually a pet peeve of mine is the frequency with which Buddhism is referred to as like, oh, it's just a philosophy rather than a
Mm-hmm.
spiritual practice or even a religion. I think it's totally both of those things. And
Mm-hmm.
insofar as how it informs my astrology, I think it's important that like the very first noble truth of Buddhism is that there is suffering, there is
Mm.
dukkha, there is some kind of dissatisfactory um, aspect to simply existing in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why I found traditional astrology so appealing coming into it, because rather than being a means of like I don't know, rather than being a means of like describing one's personality or interests, it has like the predictive techniques to
Mm.
speak to like a lot of the terrible things that happen to you in life. And even
Yeah.
if it doesn't ameliorate those things, sometimes having an explanation for why they happened or being able to frame it in the context of like, oh, wow, I spent like 3 years going through this really difficult experience, but that was my Saturn return. And now I'm more mature, more
Mm-hmm.
responsible, wiser as
Mm-hmm.
a result. Like, I think having that language is so important, and having an astrology that is open to suffering and people's daily difficulties, whether those are acute or chronic.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thanks for explaining that. Before we move on to the conversation on the moon, I just want to thank you for coming on the podcast. You were like an early financial supporter of this podcast, which I always appreciate because there is a lot of work that goes into producing this. So I just want to thank you for that and for coming on. Um, is there anything that you want to add in terms of like how we're connected with each other? I think it's mostly, just being buds on social media. in the astro Twitter sphere or what have you. But I'm
Yeah,
curious to.
I think it's just through the internet.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't had the opportunity yet to go to like any astro conferences or anything like that. But yeah, I think
Mm,
just through Twitter, and I was trying to remember today, like I came across your podcast right when you, I think, put out the first episode, and I don't even remember how I came across it, or if maybe I was
mm,
already following you or what have you. Um, but yeah, I just remember thinking it was just a strikingly good idea in the realm
mm.
of like, there's so many astrology podcasts, but just thought it was such
Yeah.
a remarkable idea, good way of standing out. It's not just another group of folks sitting around and forecasting the month ahead, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I've admired it since its inception.
Really appreciate that. Thank you. So when you think back to your childhood, Caleb, what was your relationship to the moon then, or is there like a memory that you have of the moon that kind of stands out?
Right. So I've been racking my mind for the past like few weeks to like look for a memory, and I don't know if you can like chalk this up to having the moon in a dark house or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I honestly cannot think of like a specific moment that springs to mind with respect to like the moon in my childhood. Um, Oddly, what did come up though is I remembered being young, probably like 8, 9, or 10 or something, and spending the night at a friend's house who lived out in the boonies of Illinois, like
Mm-hmm.
out in like farmland, right? And it was just, I think we were hanging out like around the campfire with his dad, and they had like at least a half acre, maybe an acre of land, and we were like looking up the stars and like trying to pick out constellations. And I remember being like super adamant that we had to find the constellation Scorpio. And
That's
luckily it
really
was
funny.
summertime, so we could find it, right? But
Uh-huh.
like I just remember I was very fixed in like needing us to find that constellation.
Did you know that you had Scorpio placements at that point, or why were you attracted to
No,
that constellation?
I have no idea. I think I just thought predatory animals were awesome.
Mm.
Sharks,
Mm-hmm.
wolves, scorpions. So I was like, if there's a scorpion in the sky, we ought to find it because that sounds incredible, you know?
Mm.
Yeah.
Very cool. So what does the moon mean to you today, and why do you think it's important that we focus on it or consider it when we talk about astrology?
Yeah. Um, so one thing that comes up is how I largely perceive astrology on one level as being a study of time, but rather in terms of like quantity, a study of
Mm-hmm.
the quality of time.
Yeah, I love
And
that definition.
right,
It's one I
like
come back to often.
yeah, yeah. And I think, if we take that image of like the giant celestial clock, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some vast mechanism with all kinds of like cogs and wheels all interlinked. The moon, besides the planetary hours, the moon is sort of like the smallest, most microcosmic cycle we can zoom in on. So if we
Mm-hmm.
think about the moon as this like this device for reckoning time, and the length of time, like just in terms of history, that the moon has been bound up in how humans have just reckoned time, like lunar calendars, lunar solar calendars. Obviously, we like our secular calendar is
Mm-hmm.
built upon the sun now, but most ancient cultures had either a lunar or a lunisolar calendar that either focused mostly on the moon or married the two together.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just like, and there are still means where this like filters in today. Like a lot of holidays are still reckoned that way with their dates kind of floating here or there.
Mm-hmm.
And like there's a line in the Hygromantia, the prayer for the moon says, "O Luna, the sign in all celebrations of festivals."
Mm.
um, so I think of that ability of the moon to bring people together, like when like the way full moons have marked when to celebrate certain holidays. It's like,
Right.
oh, the moon is at its brightest, and therefore we should gather together at this time of year. And these are the prayers we say. These are the rituals we hold. This is who we worship, or what have you. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Um, and then like on another level, just in terms of like the natal chart, I really think of the moon as indicative of dwelling place
Mm.
or environment, what one's surroundings, or like the context for a native's life. My go-to metaphor in terms of like understanding the big three is that of a plant, with the
Okay.
ascendant like describing the particular plant that the native is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, are you a cedar tree? Are you a Venus flytrap? Are you a rose bush?
Mm. Mm.
But then the sun being like this light that you are aspiring toward, like the ideals that drive your vitality. But then the
Mm.
moon being, okay, what is the soil you are planted in? Are you in a desert? Are you in a forest? Right? Are you in some kind of a seascape?
Mm.
And the moon highlighting like, oh, like you may have these ideals, you may be this kind of person, but this is the terrain that you are working within.
Right. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's a beautiful image. Um, so what does the sign of Scorpio mean to you? Can you tell me a little bit about how you understand that place or environment, or however you envision it?
Yeah, yeah. So when thinking topographically with Scorpio, there's kind of two kinds of places that come to mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fixed water sign, right? So if we think of water that is fixed in a single direction or fixed in purpose,
Mm-hmm.
what comes to mind are rivers, um, streams, but especially rivers, and the way that if we think of like the aggressive and persistent nature of rivers, the way they
Mm-hmm.
can carve and erode and wear away stone over
Mm.
millennia, like looking at the Grand Canyon and thinking, wow, that is the work of water over an immense amount of time, like the
Right.
Colorado carving that out.
Mm-hmm.
um, but then moreover, there's also the image that springs to mind of Scorpio as a place of putrefaction, of
Mm-hmm.
of of rot, of compost and decay. So like fens, swamps, bogs, marshes, places where water is fixed in terms of like, it's not a flowing movement like a river, but it moves downward. It's pushing downward, it's diving downward, and like this that stagnation, that there's like a stillness with a movement underneath, and that like many complex processes are happening to break things down, and restore them so that they
Mm-hmm.
can become something new. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, like runoff becomes potable through the filtration process, uh, which I
Mm,
don't really understand. I don't understand the mechanism, but I know that water falls, it goes through, it's filtered through the soil, it ends up in the well where it's like purified and protected,
totally,
so that it's potable.
totally.
Yeah.
I think one other thing, like tidbit that I've collected about Scorpio that I really find personally compelling,
Mm-hmm.
is that in most, but not all, like East Asian traditions of Buddhism, if we want to talk about reckoning holidays, generally the birthday of the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, or Buddha Shakyamuni, is celebrated during the first full moon of May. And like
Mm.
9 times out of 10, that first full moon is going to be the Scorpio full moon, right? That comes in May.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think there's something really like even if we don't really know when his historical birthday was, there's something very mythologically fulfilling or like archetypally rich about having this teacher who was so focused on impermanence, the transitory nature of life,
Mm-hmm.
who embarked on his spiritual journey after encountering sickness, old age, and death, right?
Yeah.
Um, there's something very striking about him having a Scorpio moon, especially like if we think about the moon as one's mother figure and the fact that his mom died when he was young, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, or if like going off of that, if we think about the sun as father and the fact that his dad was some kind of a royal chieftain, prince, some kind of princely figure, right? who
Mm-hmm.
raised him in a place that was stately and filled with Tauran delights, like fine fruits, beautiful women, incredible music, dancing, right?
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I find that rich as well.
Mm-hmm. And again, I'm reminded of the first noble truth, which you mentioned, which is basically the nature of existence is suffering for, a
Right.
poor paraphrase. And that does feel uh pretty Scorpio Moon from what I understand of talking to my guests from like the last episode of
Hmm.
this awareness, this constant kind of awareness of like birth within one's birth is one's death.
Yes.
And uh, like the process of living is the process of dying.
Hmm. Yeah.
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 You make a note here about a Celtic fable, and I'm hoping that you can tell me a little bit about that because I have this interesting connection with Scorpio that's coming to mind in relation to kind of Celtic Irish history. So
Okay.
I'm interested if you could tell me a little bit about the frog and the scorpion.
Definitely. I mean, being Celtic or like Irish myself, I'd love to hear what you have to share after
Mm-hmm.
that. But
Yeah.
uh, I don't know exactly the origin of this story, but it goes that a frog and a scorpion are sitting on the side of a river or some kind of body of water, right? And the scorpion says to the frog, like, "Oh, I'd really like to cross to the other side. Could you help me? I'll like climb on your back, and you
Mm-hmm.
could swim me across." And the frog says, like, are you crazy? Why would I do that? You're just going to sting me, and then I'll die. And the scorpion is like, no, are you crazy? Like I would die too. Why would I do something like that? That's ridiculous, right? So then the frog is like, all right, you're right. You have a deal. Let's cross the stream. And the scorpion climbs on his back, and once they're halfway across, the frog can feel the sting of the scorpion's stinger like strike him,
Mm-hmm.
and he says like, you fool, like why did you do this? And the scorpion says like, well, it's in my nature. I can't
Mm-hmm.
be anything other than what's in my nature. And together they both sink into the pond. So there's something about, again, like that wrangling with destruction, I guess, for lack of a better term, endings, the ferocious side of life,
Mm-hmm.
predatory animals. There's something very like prowling, primordial, dangerous, id like about Scorpio,
Mm-hmm.
animalistic or bestial even, where this scorpion says like, no, I am consigned to live out my fate as this aggressive creature, and though I promised otherwise, like, yes, I delivered both of us unto destruction or death or what have
Mm-hmm.
you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm reminded of, I mean, astrologically, like the rising of the fixed star Sirius for the Egyptians was coincided with the flooding of the Nile, which was very important
Right.
to their like agrarian life, their sustenance. But I'm just reminded of the nature of flooding and how it simultaneously brings plenty, but also brings destruction.
Yeah.
And the destructive element of the flood feels scorpionic to me,
Yeah.
and there's something even to like the biblical flood of
Mm.
like a cleansing.
Hmm.
um it's used as a way to cleanse the world of like some type of whatever. I don't know, I don't have formed thoughts on that, but that comes to I feel like that's unavoidable in our collective consciousness, like
Yes.
the biblical flood. um yeah, the thing that comes to mind for me for Scorpio, thinking about Irish history, is this podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with. Are you familiar with Blind Boy at all?
No.
Okay, he's like the front person for the Rubber Bandits,
Okay.
which is this like famous song, "Horse Outside," which is like just an absurd song. Like he's at a funeral or whatever in the music video, and he's talking about how everybody has like these like sports cars outside, but he has a horse, and like the girl should go with him on his horse. it's not like a country song. It's like this guy from Limerick.
Yeah.
But he has this podcast called the Blind Boy Podcast, and he does episodes about like super random shit. So he did this episode about why why he became so addicted to drinking seltzer.
Mm,
And he did this deep dive into um like the historical significance of like mineral springs in Ireland, and
mm,
how
mm-hmm,
people thought of mineral springs as like these healing bodies, but it takes incredible amounts of time for healing springs to like become what they are. And as a result, they were these protected places. So like you were it was taboo to like do certain things around
yeah,
them or what have you, or to mistreat them in certain ways. And there's this whole kind of body of mythology that springs up around that he kind of goes into, that I can't quite recall right now. But one of the interesting things is he like connects it to um to the Irish diaspora, and
mm,
how and like it, like uh anthropological or archaeological like research like around Irish American um settlements, for lack of a better term.
mm-hmm.
You can like distinguish them because you find like they find like old seltzer bottles,
Interesting.
but like around other kind of immigrant groups of the same time, those are not found. Like
Hmm.
Italian American, different
Right.
kind of your, it's like a kind of almost like a not inherited thing, but there's this kind of cultural artifact of like carbonated water,
Hmm.
and Irish Americans like drinking it
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
kind of in copious amounts because of this
Trying.
historical like
Yeah.
connection between mineral springs and healing.
Yeah.
You know, which, and I consider like the culture all around these mineral springs is very scorpionic. And you know, Scorpio is like fixed water. If we think about like it as water as emotion, it's like, okay, there's a depth of emotion, but like you don't let everybody in, because if the well gets poisoned, it takes a long
Mm,
time for that to, for that process of
yeah.
clarification, that process of filtration to like happen. You know, it's not like Pisces where there are just fucking huge waves going all over the place, and a drop of poison is going to do shit. You know, it's
Right.
not even
Right.
like Cancer, you know, where, you know, whatever the shore breaks back and forth. It's this water that really gives life, but also needs to be protected.
Right. I think that is fascinating.
Yeah.
That's cool too. Like the cultural affectation of like drinking seltzer water is almost like this way of remembering like the importance of the holy well. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that's really interesting. Um, I think like one thing that you raised there is like the healing power of the process of purgation, and how like most purgatives are like poisons of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
We think about Scorpio as being represented by a scorpion, which is it's the only like astrological sign that where the image is something that's like completely deadly. Like yeah, this the
Mm,
like the Sagittarian centaur has a like a bow and arrow, but you can also
yeah.
do that just for sport. And like the lion of Leo is deadly, but it's also it's got that mammalian love and affection still, you know. But
Mm-hmm.
like the scorpion has poison in its stinger, right? And
Yeah.
how we say the only difference between poison and medicine is in the dose, right? So if you
Right.
take a little bit of a purgative, what you end up going through is a violent and visceral process of like getting toxins out of your body. But at the end, you experience catharsis and you come to a point of being healed, right? Of um, being restored to a state of wholeness. You know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. All right, Caleb, can you tell us a little bit about your personal experience of having your moon in this place of Scorpio?
Yeah. All right. So I feel like one thing that's unavoidable here is that the moon is fallen in
Hmm.
Scorpio, right? And another way we talk
Right off the
about.
bat, what does that mean to you? What does like a planet fall mean to you?
Okay. What I really appreciated in Adam's course, he goes through a whole rationale as to how he sees exaltation and fall as essentially lunar, and domicile and exile, right? As being essentially solar, right?
Mm,
And that exaltation and fall is intrinsically bound up in fortune, either being raised to a high place, being
mm-hmm.
exalted, set on high. The story of someone who starts as like a pauper and is made a king, or the person who is brought low, who is at like starts at a high station of life and then is humbled, right, through
Mm-hmm.
circumstance,
Mm-hmm.
through the vicissitudes of fate. And like literally the words bound up in describing like depression or fall and exaltation suggest like height, right? Like a low
Right.
place, a high place.
Right.
And like the I don't remember the Greek word for depression, but it's like suggests like a ditch, right? Like a planet tripping and falling into a ditch. But I
Mm-hmm.
think we can take it not just as like a physical low point, like a trough or a ditch on the side of the road, but like especially if we're talking about the moon as mood, like a depressed mood. And
Mm-hmm.
just like I spent a majority of my life, at least thus far, grappling with depression, with like a subdued mood. Like I got diagnosed with major depressive disorder at a young age. I think I was like 7 or 8.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, just feeling like I was always inextricably stuck in this mire or this morass that I could not pull myself out of,
Mm-hmm.
like an emotional low point
Mm.
that felt like a swamp that I couldn't swim out of. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah.
like,
How have you dealt with that? If you don't mind me asking, I think um talking, from the last Scorpio moon episode, also just thinking about my own like moon Mars configuration in my
mm,
first, like I think m- martial moons, like there's this very much association with like the need for movement. I'm
mm,
wondering if you resonate with that at all, or how you've kind of learned to navigate that.
yeah. So I would say, um, just to, I guess, back up or give like further context. Like
Mm-hmm.
it all started for me when I was around like the age of 7.
Mm-hmm.
I would do these like um, thought experiments while I like laid in bed at night, and somehow like through the course of just like yeah letting my mind wander, I think I like hit upon realizing that one day I was gonna die, that
Yeah.
everyone I knew was gonna die, that
Mm-hmm.
like everything that we do at the end of the day is transitory, fleeting, will come to an end. Your deeds will be forgotten, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember my mom says supposedly that I came to her at age 7, was like, "Mom, what's the meaning of life?" But like in the sense that, like Albert Camus said, the only serious philosophical question is suicide. Like,
Mm-hmm.
why bother persisting at all if we know one day we're gonna die, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why go on when everything's transitory and impermanent, right? Why bother?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that like set me, and like looking back I can see, oh wow, that was like my opening Saturn square, and Saturn was opposed to my moon during that
Mm-hmm.
moment. But that set me on sort of like this lifelong search for meaning, and like the answers that I was searching for, right, to answer this question, the ones that I were initially given like by my mother, I found unsatisfactory, right? They didn't answer
Mm-hmm.
my question. They were not the medicine I needed for that particular illness, right?
May I
So
ask
like
what you were given at that time?
so I was like raised in a really fundamentalist Christian household, like
Mm.
pretty yeah, pretty tight, pretty closed up. Like I was given the book of Ecclesiastes and Rick Warren's The Purpose Driven Life,
Okay.
and found those like yeah, I didn't find those answers fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
I spent a long time as a kid trying to like learn eschatology and apologetics and the ins and outs of Christian theology. And I thought, like, hey, man, maybe like all the air in my chart, right? Maybe if I
Mm-hmm.
just get the facts, the doctrines in the right order, if I construct
Yeah.
this, like, this like
If I
mental
can just figure this
object
thing
of
out.
belief,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
this would all go away. So I like
Mm-hmm.
tried my damnedest to like work with what I was given until I just had to like until I came to a moment as a teenager where I was like, this does not work for me and I need to find another model, another belief system. And the
Mm-hmm.
problem was because I grew up in such like a conservative household, my access to media, to reading sources, like
Mm-hmm.
outside of like the purview of what my mom thought was comfortable was like curtailed and censored. Like I remember bringing home
Mm-hmm.
a stack of occult books when I was like 17 or 18 from the library, like hiding them under my bed. And
Mm-hmm.
then coming home one day and my mom had found them and like returned them all and that was a whole thing, right?
Yeah.
Um
I just want to
so
point out, like, what the thing that's coming to mind is that, like, the moon also represents gestating parent, and so
yeah.
there feels like a kind of scorpionic air around your mother and the environment that she, you talked about the moon as the environment, and
Yeah.
the environment that she kind of created for you, this kind of closed system.
Yeah, and if we want to talk about like having a fallen moon, it's like having uh, being born into an ill fit, right? Like it's being born into a place that doesn't necessarily nurture or support you. Like that being said, I feel like I'm pretty privileged and I've had like a relatively good life. Like I grew up in a low middle class household, right? But it was like
Mm-hmm.
on in terms of like the meat of like meaning that I needed to feel like life was worth living, I couldn't encounter it, right?
Right.
Or couldn't get the medicine I needed, right? Um, but like that's what set me on the whole path of exploring different religions, belief systems, and studying philosophy in college, and exploring occultism, doing lots of psychedelics. Like
Mm-hmm.
especially mushrooms. If you want to talk about scorpionic things, right?
Uh-huh.
Like um,
Purgatives, like literally
purgatives.
inducing a fever
Yes.
as transformation. Yeah.
And like so without all that, without the ill fit, right? I wouldn't None of that would have happened.
Mm-hmm.
And like I will say now, like yes, I find that when I get into stuck spaces, I find movement incredibly helpful, especially like I said, I'm a drummer,
Mm-hmm.
and drumming is like people ask if I play music, and I always tell them like, I don't really get chords. I don't really get scales. Like I'm a big Neanderthal with this shit. Like just give me
Mm-hmm.
something to hit with sticks and I'm happy.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And like drumming is such a visceral and primal musical experience, especially like if you're playing punk or if you're playing metal, like
Mm-hmm.
just unleashing kinetic force like
Yeah.
on the drum set I find incredibly cathartic, right? Or even just listening to super brutal music. Like I wouldn't have gotten as into metal as I am if it weren't for the fact that it was like, oh wow, I hear somebody screaming and I wish I could scream. Like they're screaming
Mm-hmm.
for me and this feels like I'm having my experience mirrored back at me, and like that being a cathartic experience too. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to leave listeners with Camus' question
Mm.
and what you got when you were a kid that was insufficient without asking you what you found to answer that question.
Oh yeah,
Why
yeah,
is
definitely.
life worth living?
Why is life worth it living? So like, it's it's funny because I feel like the what I'm going to say is going to sound like kind of like pithy or
Mm-hmm.
corny or whatever, but like this is what I have
This is
discovered.
your answer.
This is my answer, right? It life is the point of life is to live it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, its transitory nature makes it all the more like precious. Like the fact that this moment we are having right now will never be replicated, could
Mhm.
only have come about because of certain causes and conditions, and will only last for this brief hour, however long we talk. Like the fact that this moment has arisen means we should cherish it all the more, right?
Mm.
Like I don't want to be the kind of Buddhist who retreats into a monastery or a hermitage to achieve enlightenment. I want to dive as deep into life as possible and hold everything in my hands, even as I know it's passing through them like sand. Do you know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
I think is the meaning of life. That like yes, you only get one shot. It's gonna have its highs. It's gonna have its lows. It's going to be an incredible ride, and like it's this fragile thing. So like be kind to other people, and be
Mm.
kind to yourself.
Yeah, what I'm hearing coming through is kindness, presence, gratitude.
Yeah, I think gratitude more than anything else.
Yeah.
I think really has helped steer my ship in the right direction. And like being able
Mhm.
to count my blessings and know what I can be grateful for, is like really helps contextualize things even on the darkest days.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm having a very malefic out of sect station day today. Saturn stationed direct today, and I'm
Yeah.
feeling Saturn rules my second and third, and
Mm,
I'm feeling a bit of like lack.
mm,
And so I know when I'm in that place, my go-to is to like do a gratitude list, either mentally or actually writing one out if I really
yeah.
need to. But I'm curious if like if you have like a formal gratitude practice or anything like that.
Yeah, it kind of came about organically. At one point in my life, it was definitely a low point. I was actually reading a book you've brought up a lot on the podcast, The Consolations of Philosophy by
Oh, cool.
Boethius.
Yeah.
But I was married and divorced at a young age. It was kind of like a foolish, just like young, dumb thing I did, right? And
Mm,
then moved into my sister's house. I was living in her basement and sleeping on an air mattress, just kind of thinking like, what am I going to do with my life? What have I done? I feel silly, et cetera, et cetera. And like, I had a hard time sleeping and like falling asleep every night. And instead of counting sheep, what I started doing was with each breath, bringing to mind and like visualizing someone in my life who meant something to me, like who I was grateful for, and
mm,
then like on the exhale, like sending them thanks or sending them gratitude or
yeah.
like positive regard, right?
Hmm.
And would do that until I could fall asleep. And nowadays, I like sometimes I still return to that, but I think more takes the form of like before mealtime, I like to say a certain gatha, like a Buddhist prayer,
Hmm.
and take a moment to like reflect on my gratitude for the meal, but just like also like list the other things that have happened to me that day
Mm,
that I'm grateful for.
yeah. It's interesting you talked about like your pre-bedtime uh ritual, and when you're a
Yeah.
kid, it's like getting to this place where you're thinking about death, and when you're, in your 20s or what have you, you're basically like doing meta meditation, which
Yeah.
is like I've referred to a number of times on the podcast because it's been such a important practice for me,
Mm,
like the cultivation and extension of loving kindness
yeah.
to both myself, but to people in my life that I love.
Totally.
Uh, and so it's really cool to hear that evolution in your life.
Yeah, yeah. I hadn't thought about it that way, but yeah, that's cool how you highlighted that. And I'm glad
Hmm.
it's been like fruitful for you too. Like I guess I stumbled upon it accidentally. But I think like one of the like when you do it formally, like you hear a teacher doing it, the hardest part is always like the now think about somebody who you can't stand. Bring them to
Yeah.
mind and then try to
Hmm.
send them some loving kindness.
Right.
Yeah.
I do feel like once you find, I mean, personally, once you find the place of loving kindness within
Mm,
you, it gets a lot easier to cultivate it and to be able
yeah.
to because there's this interesting combination of head and heart in metta meditation where you're like
Mm-hmm.
doing all of this like physical isolation of like your chest almost,
Mm-hmm.
and like that's the
Yeah.
place, like your heart
Yeah.
center is the place where that feeling of loving kindness is being cultivated, and then you're like thinking about things, so you're almost like kind of, I don't know, it's like I have a lot of Capricorn stuff in my chart, and I feel like my thinking can tend towards the negative. And when it's
Mm-hmm.
like it's almost like one of those things we had when we were kids where it's like you press a thing and it changes like the shade. It's like putting rose colored
Oh
glasses
yeah.
almost on like
Yes.
the filter of the brain now is like filtered through rose color
I
when I'm
like that.
like maintaining this practice, and it's like a little bit less
Yeah.
negative. um
I like that when thinking of how like the Jupiter ruled signs of Sag and Pisces like bookend the Saturn ruled signs. You know, it's
mhm.
like Jupiter, like I know Saturn has to do with containment, but it almost feels like Jupiter cushioning,
Yeah,
Saturn's tougher edges, right?
yeah, shout out to Diana Rose Harper because she has an amazing lecture on that concept that she did at Norwalk last year.
Mm,
So if anybody's interested, I would definitely suggest that. She goes into the Saturn Jupiter relationship.
hmm.
Wonderful. Yeah, you've mentioned that the sign of Scorpio falls into your second whole sign house. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it's like to have the moon in that house?
Yeah, I think that was actually one of the placements that was hardest for me to puzzle out when I first started getting into astrology,
Mm-hmm.
because the second house is just like not a very sexy place. Like I think
Mm,
we'd love to have, as astrologers, we love to see a planet in the third, the ninth, the fifth, the 10th, first, whatever.
yeah.
So like it's like, what do I do with this second house moon? What is
Not
happening here?
not me
Right?
over here with my second house stellium.
Right, right. But I'm sure you've had moments too where you looked at that and you're like, you tried to puzzle it out, right?
Totally.
Like,
And then it's like you read Demetra and she's like, this is a dark house, an unfortunate place. That's how they're envisioning it. And I'm like, doesn't seem that bad. I don't know. Like,
right,
it's
right.
about to rise.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I think of the second house as like the least dark of the dark houses. Do you know what I mean? Like, it maybe we could think of it as like a room with some string lights on,
Mm-hmm.
or at least a nightlight.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Hey, sometimes you need the big light off. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Exactly, exactly. So yeah, like I think, and it like all the significations are so like tactile. It's like, oh, it's money and resources and possessions and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and I can see that in that it's like, oh, my body has been a resource in the sheer like physicality of many of my jobs, or like their
Mm-hmm.
lunar nature. Like I've done a lot of jobs in food service, so like feeding people. I've
Mm-hmm.
done a lot of work and where it's like a recurring theme of like, oh, working for a family business, right?
Right. Yeah, and
Or
for
like,
any of those that are listening, again, just to kind of paint the image for Libra risings, using whole sign houses, the 10th house is always Cancer. So the moon
yes,
always rules this place of work, no matter where kind of the MC floats to.
yes, thank you. And like caring for children, like doing
Mm,
a very nurturing role, right?
mm-hmm,
Doing lunar work, right?
mm-hmm.
But then I
Would you consider like
realized,
being a dad? Like you kind of described, most
yes,
importantly, I'm a father. Yeah.
yeah, and 100%. I think like having like a Cancer 10th house, I found kind of odd too. And it wasn't until I became a dad that I was like, especially because I didn't feel up until that point a call to any particular vocation. It's like I do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but I
Mm-hmm,
had this attitude for a long time of like a job is just what you do to pay the bills, and like
mm-hmm,
what you actually enjoy happens outside of those hours.
mm-hmm,
And so then yeah, like becoming a dad, especially insofar as like my dad was around, but he was I would say an incredibly present presence, like he
mm-hmm,
was distracted usually, and I feel like he didn't quite know how to connect to me, at least as a kid. Our like relationships gotten better now as I'm older, but like especially
mm-hmm.
becoming a dad myself and being like, You know what? Like, not a lot of other careers, vocations, whatever, have panned out in a really incredible way for me. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, like the best thing I can do with my life, like the most fulfilling, rewarding thing I can do is just be a really good dad to my daughter, you know?
Mm,
Um, so like, yeah, I think that is definitely like a strong theme there. And then like also thinking about primary motion and how you mentioned that like planets in the second are about to swoop into the first, right? And kind
mm-hmm.
of take the stage. You can think of the second house as kind of like backstage or the green room right before somebody goes out into the spotlight, right?
Mm,
Because it's
yeah.
like that's the space that the sun occupies right before sunrise, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and I realized like during that time of day, that is my favorite time of day. Like
Me too.
an hour or two before dawn, the
Mm-hmm.
sun hasn't quite risen. There's this like beautiful privacy to it, you know, that feels
Mm,
like the
yes.
entire world is your own secret, right?
Mm,
And like I like to rise early. I like to meditate, stretch. I make some coffee. I offer it to the local spirits and then my ancestors, and then drink it myself, right? And like I find that doing these like habits and routines help me. They like support everything in my first house and help me um, prepare or be ready for when the day begins to like enter it from the right space, from the right mindset. Do you know what I
mm,
mean?
absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting. That's also my favorite time of day. I'm not often
That's so,
up.
that's so cool though that you also have all those second house planets
Yeah,
though.
and I have my son like
Mm,
30 minutes after my birth, the sun rises
whoa.
approximately. So like when I'm born, I'm in this kind of interstitial place of
Yeah.
like dusk, not
Yeah.
quite sunrise, but the moon is in the sky. Yeah, so it's
That's
interesting.
interesting.
I love the light at that time. I feel like the
Yes.
light is magical for lack of a better term.
Hmm. Yeah, I think especially certain times of year too, like springtime when the days are getting brighter and you can get up right before sunrise. It's super early, right? But like
Mm-hmm.
you hear the birds chirping and you can kind of smell the flowers blooming. Or this time of year when that time is actually like pretty late. You know, it's like at
Yeah.
least where I'm at, it's like 7 o'clock, 6 o'clock.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you can go outside, but you can sometimes get a really clear view of the stars, or like right now, see Venus, like morning star
Yeah.
Venus, see her super clearly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like it just kind of imparts a sense of wonder, this like private wonder
Yeah.
before the day gets going.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. Can you tell us, Caleb, about your Mars placement, um, the sign and what house that's in your chart?
Yeah, so I've got Mars in the first,
Mm.
in Libra. It's like 24 degrees, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And yeah, so I've got a debilitated moon being ruled by a debilitated Mars, right?
Mm.
Um, and again, like this Mars has taken me a while to puzzle out as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think I really liked how in a recent episode of the astrology podcast, Austin Coppock described like Mars and Libra in that decan as being like somebody juggling many plates. And the
Mm.
image that sprung to mind for me was like playing the drums and how people will be like, oh, you need to have four brains to play the drums because you're
Right.
using both feet and your hands. And if you're like playing polyrhythms, there's multiple things going on all at once, right?
Yeah, for those
Um,
that don't play the drums, I played a little bit in high school and I never could get to this place totally, but my teacher was trying to train me to have each of my
mm,
limbs move independently.
yes,
So most people don't move their limbs doing different things with each limb
hmm,
independently, but like it's very kind of essential to drumming.
completely. But like you say, it's difficult initially to parse out how to move those limbs independently
Yeah, your
to
brain wants you to move them together.
completely,
Yeah,
completely. So then like trying to separate them out can be this like weird, jarring process, right? That feels kind of gangly and awkward the
awkward.
way
Yeah.
Mars and Libra, I think, feels gangly, ungraceful, and awkward, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, realizing like, oh, most of my martial energy has come out through a Venusian, like an artistic and aesthetic way, and that is through drumming, right? It's something
Mm-hmm.
physical, it's visceral, and but at the end of the day, I'm still like doing Venus work, but with Mars's tools, right?
Mm.
Um,
Quick question about Mars and Libra that just came to mind. Have you ever seen the movie The Square?
no,
Oh, okay. It feels like a very there's a famous scene. So it's about, I'm reading the IMDb description. A
sure,
prestigious Stockholm museum's chief art curator finds himself in times of both professional and personal crisis. Anyway, there's this scene. They're at a museum,
uh huh,
and it's like all of these people in black tie. And then the art piece is this guy comes in and he's shirtless. And if you Google the movie, you'll see like the cover. If you bought it on like Blu-ray or whatever
mm-hmm.
people buy, the cover is this guy standing around all these people in like suits and stuff, and he's shirtless, and he is acting like an ape, for lack of a better description, and he's
Yeah,
just like stalking people in the room as if he's going to like just attack them.
yeah,
And there, that feels somehow like the museum is often this Libran image,
yes,
this kind of tied up, uh, very proprietary, very like respectable,
prim
you
and
know,
proper and
prim and proper,
poised
like
perfectly, and yeah,
liberal museum goers, like on the board of the Met or what have you. And then there's just
yes,
like a fucking animal,
yes.
like like holding the room hostage, kind of
That
feels
is an
apt.
incredible Mars and Libra image. I love that because I
Mm.
definitely also think of Libra as like an art gallery, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Mars's presence there. Anytime Mars is debilitated, you just think of like where do knives, where do fighting, where are those things completely inappropriate, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
And there's an element like he doesn't attack anybody, I don't think, but there's an
mm,
element of like he's like riding the edge
yeah,
of like, oh shit, this might go fucking spin out of
yeah.
control any moment, but it's like a performance art piece.
Yeah, like the word that comes to mind is menace. He's just like menacing,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. Huh. I like that. So yeah, having that that awkward Mars ruling my moon, I think it just like kind of has doubled down on some of like the physical or like body associations with like work I've done too.
Mm-hmm.
Um like I remember going to Nate Craddock for like a vocational reading
Mm-hmm.
several years back, and he's like, "Have you ever thought about doing plumbing?" Right?
Mm.
Um, so I was like, "Oh no, I haven't." So I it was kind of this weird break where I'd already started working in education as I do now, and it was in the middle of the pandemic, and lots of education was put on pause or like online.
Right.
So I just needed a job that I could do, and I really enjoyed the sense of mastery that came with it, the knowledge of tool using that came with it,
Mm-hmm.
and like I worked with tons of martial people, people who
Mm-hmm.
chewed tobacco, smoked tobacco, cursed all the time. They were rough
Mm-hmm.
around the edges, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
We would
Yeah,
argue, but it was
absolutely know what you mean.
yeah, exactly. Like I actually really enjoyed my time in the trades. I think like working in kitchens is also like a very similar
Absolutely.
martial environment, and I'd done that before too. Um, but yeah, like especially as someone who didn't feel very competent when it came to using tools and doing DIY shit, like
Mm-hmm.
that was an amazing process of malefic remediation. Like both
Mm.
Saturn and Mars, I felt like really shone through that experience, and I learned a lot about both them and then just like real life skills
Yeah.
through that whole experience.
Yeah. I also want to point out, like I have this little kind of theory about where people's Mars placement is. Perhaps if you also have Mars in the first, like
Mm,
kind of the embodiment of that,
yeah.
like what kind of movement would be good for you. And I
Mm,
have Mars and Sag in the first, and so like I do all of this stuff with my legs. Like I
yeah.
have cycled from San Francisco to LA in a week.
Oof.
I've run a marathon. Like I
Hmm.
skateboard all the time. Like I just do all this stuff that favors my legs. And In the I forget the name of it, the Melathesia, is it, like the astrology man?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
think that's it. I could be
Libra
wrong.
rules the arms, and so it feels very fitting for Mars and Libra to be a drummer, and
Oh
for
yeah,
that
yeah,
to be kind of like a way of satisfying Mars in that sign, in that place.
yeah,
So that's
totally.
really cool as well.
Yeah, I think like having Mars in the first, maybe you can relate to this too. Just also having um, moments of just having an abundance of energy, and needing to get it out, needing to express it
Absolutely.
some way, and just
Mm-hmm.
like I've always really enjoyed bicycling too, like to get
Mm-hmm.
from point A to point B, and just for fun, and also just like walking and having stamina to walk for multiple hours and finding it enjoyable. Um, and then also like having Mars debilitated in the first, like I've because especially when I did martial work, like would always come home with cuts, bruises, burns.
Mm.
I've been hit by cars 3 times while bicycling.
Wow.
Like so like also being somewhat accident prone too.
Mm.
That I think that goes with the ungracefulness.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, just like um
I
Mars
really,
leaving his mark on my body literally,
yeah, I really hate to admit it, but I'm a bit accident prone myself.
Yeah, yeah.
Hate to admit it, but it is kind of true,
Yeah, totally.
unfortunately. Okay, cool. What about moon phase? What's your relationship of the moon with your sun, and how does that kind of color your experience of your moon?
Totally. So I have the sun in Virgo. I think you mentioned that earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So that's in the 12th house, whole sign house, and my moon is in the second whole sign house. So it's a waxing sextile, right? I was born a couple days after a new moon. And as I
Mm-hmm.
understand it, that's kind of like the energy of like that's kind of when the moon starts becoming visible after the new moon, and there's this kind of energy of kind of stepping out on one's own, a sense of curiosity and adventure, but also being kind of cautious of risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I can definitely relate to that insofar as like I think it adds further testimony to having like Uranus and Neptune conjunct my IC, and that
Mm-hmm.
being kind of bound up in the story of getting out of my conservative upbringing,
Mm-hmm.
and like getting out of that, stepping out of my own, finding a path that works best for me, but also feeling this weird pull like to or like this um, like the image that comes to mind, like I said earlier, is kind of like trying to extract oneself from a swamp, or having like really
Mm-hmm.
wet clothes dragging one down. It's like there is this pull to sort of return to the comfort and safety of what is known, while also being desirous of the unknown, of the numinous, of like what lies beyond, and kind of there being a tension there between those two impulses. You know what I mean? It's not like the waxing square, which is like much more frictional. It's like, well, there's still some support, but you're not like fully out of the gate. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah, there's this like newness that comes with like your particular distance, the distance of your moon and your sun. And there's also like seeing the potentials, like seeing what could
Yeah.
come at that frictional moment, um at the square.
Hmm.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I
um
think the
so there's this
sextile
kind
is
of
like you can see what may come of the cycle, but
mhm,
not there has been no fruit born of it yet. So there's
right.
something experimental about it, and like you said, ripe with possibilities and potentials. And
Mm,
to definitely think like common theme in my life has been like casting myself towards potentials, and kind of playing with like, oh, what, like imagining myself doing this, doing that, but then coming into difficult moments where it's like, oh, but you can only choose one path. Like, yes, you can imagine yourself going 10 down 10 different roads, but you have to choose one. Do you know what I
mhm,
mean?
yeah. And do you feel like that's perhaps like I think about, the moon and the sun really going hand in hand, and like the moon reflecting the light of the sun, so the quality of the sun's light is going to determine how the moon
Mm,
can reflect. And that feels kind of Virgoan in what you're explaining, like
yeah,
seeing all these possibilities, but having to choose a thing.
yeah,
Um, and so I'm
yeah,
curious if anything comes up in reference to that for you.
yeah, yeah. That's a good point. I think like having the Virgo sun in the 12th. Sidebar shout out again uh, to Diana Rose Harper and her
Mm-hmm.
lecture. What is it? Lamps in the Dark or
Lamps
Light
in the Dark.
Lamps
Yeah.
in the Dark, and like her whole bit about 12th house luminaries because that helped me understand my Virgo sun in the 12th a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like I don't know how much you know about tarot, but like Virgo's associated card is the Hermit,
Mm.
but if you put like a Virgo planet in the 12th, it really doubles down on that hermit feeling. Do you know what I
Mm.
mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
being this figure carrying a lantern in a dark place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like the moon, the Scorpio moon as the ill-fitting territory for like that prompted my very like 12th house solitary mystical search for knowledge, for meaning, for belief. And it has served my son well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I very much identify with like Virgoan practicality insofar as like yes we can talk all day long about incredible potentials and possibilities, but at the end of the day like we must you must choose something, or like wisdom is only valuable insofar as it has real world application, or
Mm-hmm.
I'm very much find myself these days getting like annoyed at like any kind of fanciful discussion that has no concrete practical takeaways that can like really change people's lives like
Mm-hmm.
in a way you can wrap your hands around. Do you know what I mean?
Mm.
um
In relation to astrology in particular, or just in general?
just in general, I mean, the thought that comes to mind is like having spent several years in sort of like hippie circles, and how
Yeah.
like people will talk about like, oh, we could do this project, that project, and it was like, yeah, those sound like awesome things, but like the question lingering behind every like hippie gathering is like, who's going to do the dishes? Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Who's going to clean up? Who's going to
Right.
make sure that like who's going to be backstage making sure that all this shit comes together,
Mm-hmm.
and is able to come about according to plan. And there's that like Virgoan desire to um, to see things to completion and not need recognition for it, but rather have that sheer desire that like this needs to happen, and I will do what is necessary to see it through. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, you have all of this air in your chart, and it does seem, and then like you have Venus and Leo in a fire sign, as you described at the beginning. It does seem like although the moon and the sun are like in these houses that are dark, them being in earth and water signs does feel very grounding
Mm,
for you.
hmm.
Is that something like kind of a bit of a saving grace, even though there's perhaps some challenge that comes with it too? Does that resonate?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. And I mean, like, I'm an occultist, right? So I think having luminaries in dark houses actually serves me well in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Having a
Mm-hmm.
fallen moon serves me well in a way.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, like I see, I guess what I was kind of talking about, there's definitely a tension there between, like, for instance, my Mercury Jupiter conjunction in Libra, like in an
Mm-hmm.
air sign, which I very much see as like, yeah, the years I spent studying philosophy, in which one can become lost in ivory towers and like endless discussions of like strange concepts and
Mm-hmm.
thought experiments, but how often are you really going to be confronted with needing to derail a trolley car to save,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, five people tied to the track or whatever?
I studied philosophy in college as well, and I will say I remember viscerally feeling by my senior year like disembodied. I felt
Mm-hmm.
so concentrated in my head, and I
Yeah,
felt like I was like, I just need some time off to like get back into my body.
that's such a good way of putting it, like just in a phrase, disembodied.
Mm-hmm.
That's excellent.
Yeah. and like you said, it's like, where does the rubber meet the road with these ideas? Like,
Yes,
how can we how can we materialize them? How can we make sure that they are like the theory aligns with praxis, you know? Like,
totally.
I think that that's incredibly important.
Yeah, and I think like getting back to some of my own life story I shared earlier, like I shared with somebody earlier this summer, like I learned that in this study of world religions, there's like a distinction between religions of orthodoxy, like
Mm,
right belief, and religions of orthopraxis. And I feel like
mm,
where I'm at now is I'm only interested in religions of, or like just not even religions, just like right practice. I'm
mm,
interested in things, practices that will make me a wiser, more compassionate, more grounded person. Like my issue was trying to find the orthodox belief and
right.
thinking that's what would solve the issue, and realizing, oh no,
Mm,
like I don't, the beliefs are kind of superfluous, you know,
yeah.
because if they don't pragmatically impact what you do every day,
Mm,
then who cares what you believe to some degree, you
right.
know?
Yeah, it reminds me of the tension I think about a lot of like spiritual knowledge versus spiritual experience, and
Mm,
reminds me of like the people I know and love in my life. I think about God in kind of the same way of
yeah.
like, I don't necessarily, you know, it's, I'm always like, how much do I know myself? How much do I know others? Like, we all contain multitudes and we're all
Yes.
like unfathomable depths.
Yes.
I don't know them, but I experience them. Like, I don't know what God is, but I experience the presence and love of God. And
Mm,
that's the thing that's meaningful and
yeah.
transformative, not what I know about it.
Yes. Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
Not God as a list of attributes, but God like experienced. Yes.
Yeah. And I just think it's very beautiful, you know, like again, you talked about it as a kid, you're just like, if I could just figure this out. And I've like been in that place too, where it's like, if I can just fucking work the structure out in my mind, you
Totally.
know,
Yeah.
like uh it'll be okay. But it's just like, that's not actually how it works.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. How about aspects to your moon? Are there any important ones that you want to bring up?
Um, so I guess like the moon isn't, if you just like look on the face of my chart, it's not really making any dramatic aspects. There's like the sextile to the Neptune Uranus conjunction I mentioned earlier. But if you do grant the moon like the 13-degree orb, we
Mm-hmm.
sometimes do. Like if you just observed what happened the day I was born, right? The moon swept over to my um, Pluto in Scorpio, right? And was
Mm-hmm.
conjunct Pluto in Scorpio. I've got the that millennial placement, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then it also activates the T square that I've got between Pluto and Scorpio, and then Saturn and Aquarius opposed to Venus and Leo.
Mm-hmm.
And that I feel is like that is the aspect in my chart that just like um, dominates so much of it.
Mm-hmm.
Those are like that. Those two forces I feel like are constantly opposed, like Venus versus Saturn. You know, as opposite ends of this seesaw with the
Mm-hmm.
moon and Pluto kind of tugging upon it. I think like if we just look at Pluto, I think like I was talking about earlier, my soul searching when I was much younger. I think to use like kind of a swear jar quarter word, I was just very intense as a young man. You know what I mean? And I
Mm-hmm.
think I kind of scared some people off, or I was just like very just had this like white knuckle grip on life, and this like
Mm-hmm.
this sense of like I need to figure this out. You know, like
Yeah.
I need to sort this out, like, and this urgency that you know, like Pluto touches something and just like adds this feeling of intensity, of the stakes being so high, right?
Literal life and death.
Yeah, life and death. Why should I keep living, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I see my moon is like connected to that, with then like the Saturn Venus tension or opposition often playing out as like I relish socializing, creativity, connecting with others, but also relish my time spent alone.
Mm-hmm.
Like I have Saturn in the fifth, and I find that my greatest creativity comes from like solitary walks in Aquarian spaces in the hinterlands, at the fringes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of the tension between wanting to fuck off to the middle of nowhere to work on my book
Mm-hmm.
or hang out with friends, you know what I mean? And enjoy just the finer things of life, you know?
Mm. Yeah, there's just this interesting thing in terms of like rulership of Libra in your
Mm-hmm.
chart where you have all of the rulers aspecting the ascendant. You
Mm-hmm.
have the domicile lord, Venus, you have the exaltation lord, Saturn, and then you have Mercury and Jupiter, which are triplicity lords of air in the
Yeah,
first house. And so there's this just really interesting thing of like wondering if the opposition is mitigated at all by like Saturn somehow, in trine to your ascendant, like resourcing that place as well, or
definitely.
perhaps like an avatar for you and the kind of tension between Venus and Saturn in that way. Venus also as like ruling Libra, so being an avatar.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think like there are plenty of routes that make that workable in my chart, and I
Mm-hmm.
think I have like some really good fortune in terms of like mitigating factors that kind of smooth that out. I think like the best way I can paint it in like an image or an anecdote is in my senior year of college, writing my senior thesis in my dorm room about death and Heidegger and like
Mm-hmm.
existentialism, right?
Mm-hmm.
While outside in the living room, my friends are drinking, talking, um, DJing, playing music, right? And
Uh-huh.
then like finishing my labor, right? Like finishing that writing project and then walking out into the living room and being like, all right, now let's party, you know?
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Yeah, like they aren't, it's not that I can't have both, right? It's not
Right.
like they're completely opposed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, why not both?
Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, it's like, yeah, it's so fitting too. Like Saturn in the fifth, ruling the fifth, like solitary writing, and then Venus in the 11th, ruling the first. Like, yeah, let's party, baby. Like
Totally. And
that's.
I think it's also like, oh, if you look at my creative output, it's like, oh, like what I create is like is pro malefic, right? It's Saturnian in nature.
Mm-hmm.
I've mostly made music in metal bands, right? So it's like
Mm,
I make heavy music, right? So
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, there's a cool thing too. I'm just like riffing on triplicity lords now with your
Mm,
second, where your moon is. Like the moon is its own triplicity lord, and then Venus is a triplicity lord as well of water.
mm,
So there's like this aversion to Mars in the first, like a kind of lack of resourcing, you would think,
mm-hmm.
in Scorpio, but there is this kind of Venusian lunar resourcing of that place also.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how that plays out for you, if that's resonant at all in any way, but just interesting to note.
Yeah, I think if anything, it's like, you know, I'm not incredibly well off, right? And that I think
Mm-hmm.
that is sometimes the what my internal voice will kind of like bitch about, you know, it's like, I just wish I had more money. I wish I wasn't so broke. I wish like the economy, like I wish inflation wasn't killing me or rent wasn't killing me or like
Mm,
these little things I just complain about in terms of like second house topics. But then
yeah.
being like, "Oh, but I find my job as a teacher so fulfilling. I find my role as a
Mm,
father so fulfilling. And like, I wouldn't trade what I do now for having instead become a professor of philosophy at a university or becoming a lawyer or, like
mm-hmm.
aiming for a job that would have brought in more income, but would not have been perhaps as like relationally and emotionally fulfilling, you know what I mean, as caring for kids all day long, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's really important. It's like what ultimately is success. It's like that's something
Yeah,
what ultimately is self-resourcing in the second house. And
totally.
that's going to be different for everybody. But to have your malefic out of sect rule your second, which is like again,
It's not
I'm having
optimal.
I'm having malefic out of sect station day. Saturn in my second, ruling my second. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, there's some tough stuff that comes with like feelings about resourcing
Yeah, yeah,
for
just
sure.
feeling scrappy sometimes, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Have you tracked the cycles of the moon in relation to your own life? And if so, what have you found?
Yeah, so I will say that like you've seen in my chart, like I've got big late summer, early autumn energy, right? You could say
Mm-hmm.
with like most of my planets being placed from like late Leo to early mid Scorpio, and like when the moons just swings through that band of the zodiac, like
Mm,
I feel usually like pretty high spirits or rejuvenated as it kind of like hits each one of those signs.
mm,
I've noticed that just like around new moons, my energy is kind of like comes to a lull. I have a greater need for rest, a greater need for sleep, and I have less energy I can devote to creative outputs. And then like around the full moon, I sometimes have a hard time sleeping. But it's like I don't sleep that much, but I don't need the rest either. So having like
mm,
a high point in terms of just energy around those times as well. And then like I know a lot of people had a tough time when we had Scorpio moons uh, the while Saturn was in Aquarius. I remember
yeah.
like seeing people complain about that on Astro Twitter. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
dude, I'm having my lunar return right now. Like I feel great most of the time when the moon
Mm-hmm.
is in Scorpio.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think like really just watching the way the moon spins around my chart and will highlight the house topics,
Mm,
as it moves from sign to sign, I've always found fascinating and such a good practice for like embodying astrology on a day-to-day level and just also understanding my own chart too.
wonderful. Yeah, in line with that, do you have any other suggestions for like new adherents of astrology or planetary relationship and forming or initiating a relationship with the moon?
Yeah, so like I think that one of my bugbears, or like one of my uh what soapboxes, right, is
Mm-hmm.
that like I think it's really easy in this era to um get abstracted away from the literal sky, the like
Mm,
literal planets and
so easy.
stars, right? That like form our practice. Like astrology is a visual practice. And if you're not going out and looking at the sky, looking at the planets, like you're just playing with concepts and symbols, and it can become disembodied, like you said,
Yeah.
right? I think like one of my most important experiences was like literally staying up all night once on a full moon during 2020 and watching every single planet rise in the east after sunset
Mm,
and culminate overhead and set, you know what I mean, like one after
wow.
another. And that was such a game changer, being able to see like literally what does each planet look like, and then also like nowadays starting to see, oh, like there's this planet also next to this fixed star too, right, and starting to bring
Mm,
in what that implies.
mm-hmm. Awesome.
um, and then I think like in terms of like forming relationship to the moon, I've been thinking about how the moon is already this like object of devotion,
Mm-hmm.
for even non-astrologers like songwriters, poets, and just mystics throughout the ages, and how like so many works of art, like poems and songs, have been written about or for the moon. Like the
Mm-hmm.
very first composition we have, like a written composition that you can play, like a piece of sheet music, is a Mesopotamian um, like oration, a prayer, what have you, to a goddess who's like the wife of the moon god in
Mm-hmm.
a Mesopotamian culture, right? So I think like finding a lunar prayer, like a poem about the moon, a song about the moon that like resonates with you, and like being able to look the moon in the eye and read it to her, him, them, however you
Mm-hmm.
conceptualize the moon, is like a great way to start building a bridge, like a relationship with the moon, to
Yeah.
speak to them, whether it's with your words or someone else's.
Mm. What's your song?
I really like the I really like the prayer of Monday or of the moon from the Hygromantia. There's
Okay.
it's a grimoire, like a book, and it's all based in like planetary magic. There's also like a lunar calendar from the Hygromantia that I use as part of my magical practice
Mm-hmm.
for like scheduling when I do different types of workings, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I really love yeah, the prayer to the moon in that text.
Cool. All right, Caleb, are any imparting thoughts about the moon before we close?
Any parting thoughts? I've been stepping out lately and trying to look at the moon as much as I can, and I just want to like kind of reiterate or hammer home that like please go take in the beauty of the moon, because for me like every time I see it, there's just this like little gasp, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
hope and don't think it will ever get old for me like looking at the moon, and like loving that sense of wonder that
Mm-hmm.
arises just by taking it in, you know.
Wonderful. All right, where can we find you? And is there anything that you're working on that you'd like to let us know about?
Yeah, so you can find me at Heavy Metal Astro on most socials. I think on Twitter and a couple other places it's Serpent Star or Serpent Star 93. Um, my main content I create is writing short transit reports or like mini essays about different things that are happening, like squares, oppositions, ingresses, full moons, what have you. And I
Mm-hmm.
always pair what I write with some song from sort of my encyclopedic library of heavy metal, right? Whether it's something death metal, doom,
Mm-hmm.
black metal, whatever, right? Um, and then I just launched like a week ago from when we recorded this a new Mars focused reading. So looking specifically at Mars in the birth chart, in the
Cool.
nativity, and trying to suss out, you know, based on decanic strength and house placement, essential and accidental dignity, stellar relationships, like how does this particular Mars show up for this person as a warrior, as a weapon, and as a wound? And helping
Mm-hmm.
people to figure out how they can best embody the red planet in their life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm donating a portion of all those, the proceeds from those readings to wolf conservation as sort of an act of devotion to Mars himself.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Cool.
I've been doing like a essay series also where I kind of archetypally compare different metal subgenres and the signs, and I've kind of set that. I did three of them, and then I set it aside for the summer. But I'm returning to that soon. So later, sometime during Scorpio season, I'll be dropping one on death metal and its
Mm-hmm.
relationship to Scorpio,
Hell
which I'm
yeah.
pretty excited about.
Yeah, you like referenced past podcast episode with
With Cameron, right?
Cameron Cassidy, yeah, the Pisces moon
Yes.
episode for your Saturn and Pisces essay, right?
Yeah, yeah, it was all about Saturn and Pisces and the relationship to post metal, which is kind of like
Mm,
this subgenre of metal that like takes metal but then like blends different forms of it, but blends it with other forms of music too. And I talked about the diffuse, um, sort of oceanic or all-encompassing nature of Pisces and how that
yeah,
can kind of show up in certain forms of music.
super cool.
Yeah,
All right, Caleb. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your experience and sharing your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope I can talk to you again soon.
yeah. Thank you, man. Be well.
To support the show by donating or becoming a member, please visit my website, which is linked in the show notes. And please subscribe to the show wherever you listen. You can also find me on Instagram and Twitter. See those links in the show notes as well. If you have any questions or feedback on the show, please feel free to contact me via my website or email me at sphallhorary@gmail.com. In the show notes, you can also find links to astrologers and resources that we touched on in this episode. Thanks. See you next time.